Welcome to my fourth and final episode of my Sega Ages 2500 coverage. We're going to be looking at the last 9 games in the series, and right about now is where the games really started to get good. Let's take a look. Sega Ages 2500 Volume 25 Gunstar Heroes Treasure Box would be released in February of 2006. It would contain some of Treasure's finest 16-bit work, Gunstar Heroes, Dynamite Deka, and Alien Soldier. Unlike early Sega Ages 2500 releases, these games are mostly untouched and presented in their original forms. Gunstar Heroes, of course, needs little introduction, as it's one of the Genesis and Mega Drive's finest run-and-gun shooters. The emulation here is solid, with mild changes in sound tones here and there, but nothing egregious or broken. The graphics presentation is gorgeous in 480p, and I highly recommend this mode if you have the means. Gameplay is spot on in just about every way, and I noticed nothing that kept me from doing what I was able to do on the Mega Drive. It's a solid version of the game in nearly every single way. There's also an early press demo prototype of the game hidden on here, with small changes to the sound, graphics, and weaponry. Dynamite Deka is by far the weakest game on the disc, and that's not a knock on the game, but rather a testament to how solid this compilation is. You know the drill here as well. Deka is a puppet that can change heads for various power-ups and attacks. The reproduction is again rock solid, with only mild sound changes hardcore fans will notice. The game again looks great in 480p, and plays as good as the 16-bit version. Perhaps the most interesting addition to the disc is Alien Soldier, a game that has never seen a physical release in North America and is rare everywhere else. I've been a fan of Alien Soldier for years. The game is a graphic and sound monster for the Mega Drive, easily one of the best showcases for the power of the architecture. It's frantically fast, has monster-sized sprites, and could damn near pass for a Neo Geo game. The game isn't without its problems, however. The game has spikes in difficulty that will challenge even seasoned run-and-gun fans, and the gameplay can be incredibly difficult to come to grips with. The first thing you'll need to do is master the dash, a move that allows you to move quickly away from danger and gives you a second of invulnerability. Weapon mastery is a must as well, mainly because you are in danger every second of the action, so changing weapons leaves you open to damage. You'll be replaying this one over and over to get anywhere, as you get used to the controls, but don't give up, because once you understand what the game wants you to do, you'll be a wrecking machine backed by the 68,000 Heart on Fire. Also included on this disc is the Game Gear and Sega Master System versions of Dynamite Deka and Gunstar Heroes, but honestly, they lose appeal sitting next to vastly superior versions. Gunstar Heroes Treasure Box will run you around $70 for a complete copy, and since the games included here easily eclipse this price, it's a must-own for the machine. April of 2006 would bring us Sega Ages 2500 Volume 26, Dynamite Deka. Western Saturn fans will remember this one as Die Hard Arcade, a beat-em-up loosely based on the Bruce Willis film from the 1980s. You are a cop that must battle your way through countless foes in an effort to stop a terrorist group from taking over a skyscraper. The original STV Titan arcade version has been overhauled entirely, with new models, textures, and special effects. The result is a game that looks worlds better than the original, adding a visual pizzazz that helps the presentation be far more palatable. The beat-em-up gameplay remains intact, and if you enjoyed this one before, you should here as well. Love it or hate it, this was ultimately Sega's continuation of games like Streets of Rage and Golden Axe. Obviously not the intellectual property itself, but the gameplay and style. Weapons are everywhere for you to use, and you'll face crazy objectives like robots, fire trucks, sumo wrestlers, football players, and water fountains all gone rogue. You can punch, kick, grab, and pull off wrestling moves as well, and all this is made better by the 2-player co-op. There is also a ton of extra modes that allow you to add costumes and new objectives. These modes are mostly novelties, but do add some fun to the base game. If you are a purist and want to experience the STV game in its original form, that version is here as well. It looks rough next to the upgraded PS2 version, but still has great nostalgia power. The lone problem with this release is the price, which hovers around the $40 to $50 mark, while the original Japanese Saturn release can be gotten for sub $20 regularly. Whether the PlayStation 2 editions are worth it to you will determine your viewpoint on this one, but it's overall a fantastic addition to the series if you're a fan of 3D beat-em-ups. Also in April of 2006, Sega Ages 2500 Volume 27 Panzer Dragoon would be released. Make no mistake, Panzer Dragoon is one of the best games ever made in my eyes. It's an artistic powerhouse of visual style, with an orchestral soundtrack that's as powerful as any film score. This version of the game does not mess with a good thing, mostly just upgrading the Dragon model and adding some filtering here and there. This makes this version of the game the best looking release, besting both the Xbox and PC versions of the game. There's also a Pandora's Box option that allows you to mess with a few options, and there are North American and Japanese difficulty settings as well. The game itself is as powerful as it's ever been, and the on-rail shooting action will keep fans glued until the very end. If you want the original untouched Saturn release, that's here too, though it's noticeably worse looking next to the upgraded model and filtering of the PS2 enhanced release. My lone complaint centers on the full motion video intro and cutscenes, which look just terrible here. These could have been cleaned up and given significant upgrades. Outside of that, this is an awesome addition to the series, and one you're likely familiar with, so I'll simply let the game speak for itself. In September of 2006, Sega would release the surprise compilation, Sega Ages 2500 Volume 28 Tetris Collection. That's right, Sega actually owned the Japanese arcade rights to Tetris in the late 1980s, and was able to release multiple versions of the game. The System 16 version was by far the most popular version for Sega, taking the Japanese arcades by storm in 1988. Impressed with its success, Sega would then develop a low-cost System E version of the game, which was essentially a Master System based arcade board. It again would do well, prompting Sega to port the game to their Japanese home console, the Mega Drive. This version was met with immediate resistance by license holder Bulletproof Software, who claimed sole dominion over the license for home systems. Sales were stopped after a very limited release, and that version would go on to be one of the machine's hardest to find games. Not to be deterred, Sega would simply change the game over to its Megatech arcade hardware, where the game would again do well. Sega would also mess around with the Tetris formula a bit, releasing Flashpoint in 1989 on the System 16. Here you would be given various puzzles where you would need to clear out flashing blocks. Gameplay would be Tetris style otherwise, and this is perhaps one of the best versions of the game I've ever played. There are a ton of puzzles with increasing difficulty, and some of the higher up levels need some serious strategy to beat. Various backgrounds and characters show up from other Sega franchises, adding to the appeal. There's also an unreleased Mega Drive version of this game you can play. The final game in the compilation is Block Seed, another take on Tetris released in 1989 on the System 18, System 16, and the System C. This version introduced power blocks that would do various things, like blow up other blocks, clear random lines, or drop random blocks on the screen. There is also bomb powers that allowed you to target specific areas and destroy them. The strict drop counter pushes blocks up from the bottom of the playfield every 5 drops, adding to the challenge. This version of Tetris is quite good as well, and I enjoyed my time with it. Overall, this package offers little you haven't seen before, but the graphics and sound are solid, and Flashpoint has enough going for it to make this compilation worth a look if you're a fan of the puzzle genre. In March of 2007, we'd get one of the best compilations ever released with Sega Ages 2500 Volume 29 Monster World Complete Collection. No joke, if you grew up on the Wonder Boy series, you are going to absolutely adore this disc. First you get the venerable Wonder Boy in its System 1 arcade form. Its colorful graphics and familiar soundtrack is a great blast from the past. You'll also get the Japanese Mark III version, which was a fair bit harder, but still looked and sounded nice. The Japanese and Western versions for the Game Gear are also included. These are more novelty than anything, but it's nice to see them here. Finally, you get the SG-1000 version of the game, which scrolls freaky as hell, but plays surprisingly good. Next up is Wonder Boy Monster Land, a Sega System 2 arcade game that would put the series on the path to the RPG hybrid it'd become. This one feels a hell of a lot like Zelda 2 on the NES, both in gameplay and objectives. We'd also get the Mark III version of the game, titled Super Wonder Boy Monster World. This is an excellent port of the arcade, with remarkably close graphics and sound. It plays great too, and is still worth beating all these years later. This compilation really starts to get good with Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair. You get the original System 16 version in all its glory, a platforming run-and-gun shoot-'em-up hybrid that is fun as hell. Power-ups are everywhere, the pace is non-stop, and the genre mashups really keep the game going until the very end. You also see the Mega Drive version of the game, and while it takes a hit in both graphical and sound quality, it still plays great. Both these versions are great additions, and offer tons of gameplay. Also included is the Game Gear and Master System versions of Monster World 2, which was also known as Wonder Boy The Dragon's Trap in the West. The Game Gear version is again a curiosity, but the far superior Master System version is infinitely more playable. It looks and sounds great, and is a solid and often forgotten entry in the series. The numbering system began to get funky with Monster World 3, which was actually Wonder Boy 5 in the mainline series. This collection would include the Japanese Mega Drive version, as well as the more simply named Western release, Wonder Boy in Monster World. The series would go back to the mixed genre format of Monsterland and was all the better for it. Its combination of RPG elements and platforming made for a hell of an adventure. The Master System also received this game, and wow, what a port it was! It didn't look as nice as its 16-bit big brother, but it did do the hardware seriously proud, giving us a game that played just as good and one of the Master System's best games. The disc, of course, wouldn't be complete without the awesome Monster World 4, which is here only in its Japanese Mega Drive form. This sucks, but the game is still quite playable and easily beatable with only mild help from a walkthrough or FAQ if you are unsure about doing something. All these games would benefit from 480p support and look great over component. The disc has risen substantially in price in recent years, going for around $100 complete. Sega Ages 2500 Volume 30 Galaxy Force 2 Special Extended Edition would get released in July of 2007. I had actually been looking forward to this, as there had never really been a 100% accurate home conversion of Galaxy Force 2. The Saturn version had been really close, but it was nice to finally have the great looking arcade intact. As one of the best looking superscalers ever released, it was originally done on Sega's Y arcade hardware, a sprite scaling monster responsible for other games like Power Drift and Rail Chase. Galaxy Force 2 itself hits the notes of an afterburner in space, where you fly through predetermined routes, attacking with auto-locking missiles and a Vulcan-style rapid-fire standard weapon. The flight path is locked, but you can move freely within that path to avoid obstacles and enemies. Stages end with the raid of the core of the enemy's base, which you must destroy and move on. The gameplay is simple, of course, but the draw to Galaxy Force has always been its incredible presentation. The original arcade game was a tour de force of sprite scaling and rotation, and its release in 1988 meant that no home console or computer was even close to powerful enough to pull it off. This meant the game would go years before a home version came close, hurting its standing with fans of the arcade game wanting to experience its graphical thrills. The PlayStation 2 release here includes the original arcade version, intact and looking great, but also an upgraded version called Neo Classic. This adds filtering, an improved model for the main ship, transparency effects, and full 16:9 support. A few other versions of the game are included as well, essentially chronicling the difficulties of bringing the game home to consoles at the time. First is the Master System version, called simply Galaxy Force after the first release of the arcade game. It remains a third-person spaceship shooter, but takes an incredible hit to the presentation on every single level. The sprite scaling is now just enemies flashing across the screen in a few frames. The levels are far more simple in design, and most of the larger objects and enemies are completely removed. The game isn't unplayable, but is a major downgrade to the point where it's the same game in name only. The Mega Drive version of the game is here too, and while it resembles the arcade far more than its Sega Master System counterpart, it too is a mere shadow of the arcade's presentation. This one attempts to recreate a scrolling playfield and scaling sprites, but comes off as just a slow-paced shooter with choppy scaling. The Mega Drive was a great piece of technology in 1988, but the bleeding-edge Y arcade board was simply a technological marvel far in excess of the home system's abilities. If you had an appreciation of the arcade, this compilation has something to offer you, but if your opinion of the game is based solely on the home ports, you may want to skip this disc. It goes for around $70 on eBay, so it's definitely for the fans of the game only. In October of 2007, the series would see Sega Ages 2500 Volume 31, Cyber Troopers Virtual On. This is a port of the Model 2 one-on-one mech battle game, taking place in 3D arenas. You have long-range attacks that allow you to dish out punishment halfway across the arena, as well as melee attacks that do major damage in close. You have a great selection of mech designs, ranging from fast units with a great balance of attacks to slower big units that dish out crazy damage. The gameplay is not instantly accessible, and you'll need to invest time to understand the play mechanics. The arcade had a twin stick control setup, and the PS2 dual analog sticks are an acceptable approximation of that setup. Movement is the hardest thing to master here, with stick combinations determining dashing, jumping, and turning. This is not intuitive at first, and you'll need to practice to get the hang of it. Once you do though, it plays like nothing else on the market, and is a truly frantic combat game. The PlayStation 2 version here recreates the arcade faithfully, with great looking models, the choice of 60 frames per second, and the arcade's original 57.5 frames per second, as well as widescreen support and 480p support. It is by far the definitive version of the original arcade game. There are also a host of modes and extra options from there. There is a versus link mode for 2 players, 2 systems, and 2 televisions. There is an assault mode that is melee only, as well as a chibi mode that shrinks your mech to toy-size models. This is definitely a package for hardcore fans, but Virtual On remains one of the most unique games of its era, often not getting nearly the credit it deserves. It's another great addition to the Sega Ages series, and well worth its $50 asking price on eBay. The compilation goodness would continue with Sega Ages 2500 Volume 32 Phantasy Star Complete Collection, released in March of 2008. Phantasy Star was no stranger to the compilation treatment, as the Sega Saturn had gotten one itself. The difference here is that this version actually included the English versions of the games, a rare addition to games of this type. Emulation of these games is solid, with the only downside being some slight differences in some of the sound effects and music. Otherwise, you'll get great progressive scan options that make the game look very nice, as well as a bunch of game enhancements that change the gameplay a bit. Speed options are front and center, allowing you to greatly speed up the battle and walking speed during gameplay. There are also difficulty adjustments where you can take a game that was notoriously hard like Phantasy Star 2 and make it much easier, increasing your abilities to gain money and level up faster. The 4 mainline Phantasy Star games are all represented here in English, with the sole disappointment being the lack of English versions for the rest of the package. Besides Phantasy Star 1 through 4, you also get Phantasy Star the Text Adventure games, as well as the 2 Japanese exclusive Game Gear Phantasy Star games. I won't bore you with any specifics here, as they are all in Japanese and virtually unplayable to those that don't read the language. This disc goes for around $60 to $70 complete, making it a damn sight cheaper than buying all 4 games for the Genesis. They were included in the Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, which is really inexpensive and loaded with many other great games. The series would wrap up with its final game in September of 2008, with Sega Ages 2500 Volume 33 Fantasy Zone Complete Collection. As one might assume, this compilation spans the many games in the Fantasy Zone series. First, you get the original arcade System 16 version of Fantasy Zone. This perfect rendition plays just like you remember, and is essentially a colorful version of Defender. You can fly left or right at will, destroying the enemy bases and then facing a level boss. It's a simple but highly entertaining shooter that doesn't get enough credit. You also get the Master System version of the original game, a much less impressive entry visually, but a game that is still very playable. The real star of this disc is Phantasy Zone 2, however. This one was originally done on the System E and Master System, hardware that was virtually the same. This meant a sharp decrease in graphical quality from the first Phantasy Zone game. Sega would go back for this release and remake the game according to the System 16 specification, dramatically increasing the game's visual fidelity and sound quality. This remastered game is as the game should have been originally, and it suits the game far better than the original Master System hardware. That version is included as well if you have the fondness for it. Phantasy Zone gear is included as well, but this inclusion is again a novelty and virtually worthless next to vastly superior versions of the game. It does have some new stages and music, so it's cool to mess around with a few times. Luckily, the Sunsoft developed Super Phantasy Zone for the Mega Drive is included, and is essentially a continuation of the original game. It was never released in North America in cartridge form, so being able to own a physical edition of the game makes it a big plus for this disc. Unfortunately, the addition of Opa Opa is not so great. This cross between a puzzle and action game has the star of Phantasy Zone, Opa Opa, solving puzzles a la Pac-Man while avoiding enemies and collecting power-ups. It's not a good game, and I found I was tired of it literally minutes into its gameplay. It's not a Phantasy Zone game in any way, and a poor direction for the series. Finally, there is Galactic Protector, a Japanese Mark III game starring Opa Opa, in which you must defend various planets from incoming enemies and debris. The playstyle is very different from previous Phantasy Zone games, only allowing Opa Opa to orbit the planet as he defends it. It's a simple addition that wasn't released in the West, and is good for a couple of playthroughs. Hidden away on the disc is Phantasy Zone Neo Classic, a redux of Sunsoft's own 1987 Famicom port of the original arcade game. Everything here has been touched up with additional color and music remixes, while still retaining the feel of the original game. It's a great addition for fans of that game. All this Phantasy Zone goodness can be yours for about $70 or so, which is actually a good price considering the Mega Drive version of Super Phantasy Zone can go for more than that by itself. Now your mileage with the Sega Ages 2500 series is gonna vary. Honestly, if you own these games in their original form, there's not a lot of appeal here. But if you do not own these games, they are great ways to experience them. A lot of these games have tons of extras that other versions of the game simply do not have. As a matter of fact, going back and playing all the volumes of the Sega Ages series again, it's made me wonder to myself, why the hell is there no Sega Ages series currently? Why is there no PlayStation 4 Sega Ages? Why aren't these old, awesome arcade games seeing any kind of appreciation? Hell, we never even got a home version of some of Sega's best arcade games. This would be a great time to do it. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you next time.